Welcome to this week's episode of Talking Therapy. Talking Therapy is the companion podcast to my YouTube series In Therapy, where we follow brave participants on their real-life therapeutic journeys with me. My mission with these series is to really break the stigma around mental health, chronic illness, and the reality that we all struggle. We all go through challenging times in our lives, particularly perhaps now more than ever. I'm recording this week's episode in full-on lockdown in the UK, not even able to go into the studio. It means I'm filming myself, so please bear with me. I've tried to set up the best I can, but you won't see the usual 3 cameras and the amazing production that Oliver and Rachel usually do. I do miss those guys today. So in this week's episode, we're going to be diving deeper into the inner critic. This is a theme that's been coming up for David in his episodes in Therapy. It's also something that's been a theme for previous participants, I think partly because it's a theme for everyone. We all have that voice inside of us, which is judging us, criticizing us, constantly beating us up. So in this episode, I'm going to explore some themes that come out in David's episode around particularly the exercise that I did with David around role-playing his inner critic with him. I'm also going to respond to a few questions that came up around David sharing some of the vulnerability of his therapeutic process being filmed and being shared with the world. I'm going to answer some questions around how do you... Sorry, I've got to find my questions. Does the inner critic take us back to times in our life when we've suffered from trauma? So the relationship between the inner critic and trauma. And also, how do you stop projecting your inner critic onto other people? One of the things that can happen with the inner critic is we don't just experience ourselves beating ourselves up and judging ourselves. We also project our inner critic onto other people, and we imagine that they're judging us and criticizing us and beating us up. So in this week's episode of In Therapy, David has been continuing his battle with his inner critic. And you may have noticed I conducted a therapeutic exercise with David, and I encouraged him to defend against it. I became his inner critic for a moment, and I asked him to defend against. And here's a short segment from what happened. So let's do it again. So, you really should have waited 4 weeks.
Oh.
Okay, how did that feel?
Felt in my teenage years.
Do you feel? I mean, it felt to me that it was a bit more like a bit more of a sort of pushback against it.
Yeah.
Does it feel that way to you?
Yeah, but I guess what I'm finding a wee bit difficult about it is it's in my head. It's if it's somebody sitting in front of me, or if it's somebody on the bus, or if it's somebody walking down the street, you can sort of say, and get away from them.
But you can also say side of your head. So I want to speak a bit to why do I use this approach? Obviously, it was a bit delicate for David. I think particularly having cameras and being filmed, it's almost like there's thousands of other inner critics that are sort of coming in that way as well. But you see, one of the key things with our inner critic, if you can see it, you don't have to be it. You don't have to be at the end of it. The more awareness we have of our inner critic, the more that we can catch it, we can see it playing out, that gives us the potential to have more space. And by speaking someone's inner critic to them, that just helps put it out, in a sense, in the world. And by doing that, sometimes that alone, people go, oh my God, am I actually saying that to myself? And that in of itself gives them some distance and some space. But also, the inner critic is a habit. We've become conditioned, we've trained ourselves to speak to ourselves in a certain way. And like any other habit, we want to be able to learn to break that habit. We want to be able to see it, to catch it, to stop it, and retrain that part of our mind, retrain that part of our experience. And so by me speaking the attacks of David's inner critic and him defending against me, He's learning to practice to defend, not just in that moment, but to have that as a capacity and skill that's available for him then throughout his life. There's a model that I go into in some depth as part of the Reset program, my 12-week online coaching program, which is the RIDD model. RIDD is an acronym for recognize. The first thing is to just recognize we're being attacked. A lot of the time, we're judging ourselves, attacking ourselves, beating ourselves up. We're not even aware that we're doing it. So firstly, to recognize. We then need to identify. We need to be able to name what is the actual attack which is happening. Remember, if you can see it, you don't have to be it. The more awareness there is of that attack, the better. We then need to defend. That's what I was practicing doing with David. Telling our inner critic to F off. And there is some quite colourful language in the episode, and I do explain in the episode why we use that language. Sometimes just visualizing almost like a tennis racket and sort of whacking away our inner critic, but having some way of defending against the fact that we're being attacked. The fourth step in the RIDD model is we then want to disengage. One of the things that's happening with our inner critic is we're just in this loop of judgment, criticism, beating ourselves up, attacking ourselves. By disengaging, it's almost like going from being in a game of tennis with our inner critic, that it attacks us, we hit the ball back, and trying to sort of tell it to go away, it attacks us again. We want to put the racket down and walk off the court. We want to disengage from that process, that experience of internal judgment, attacks, and criticism. So you want to recognize, you notice you're being attacked, you identify, you name the attack, you defend, and you then disengage. By practicing that with David, it's helping him have more capacity and more awareness of how to then get himself some freedom. It's something that I then set him as some homework as part of the Reset program. There's a module that goes much more in depth into this, and I know that helped him really consolidate and deepen what he was learning. I think also some of you noticed that it was quite an awkward exercise for David. And sometimes I think people can feel concerned that something might feel uncomfortable for someone in that moment. And although I'm obviously not a fan of making people uncomfortable for the sake of making them uncomfortable, there's a reality that when we change, sometimes it's challenging. Sometimes we find ourselves in some unfamiliar places. And it's almost by definition of finding ourselves in an unfamiliar place, that means that something new is happening. Because if where we are feels familiar, it's probably a place that we've been historically in the past. When we come to a place that feels like new and it perhaps feels a little bit scary or we feel a little bit unsure, that means that there's the potential that something new is happening. So it's always the therapeutic balance of how much you challenge people, how much you push people. But I'm always keen to take people to places where they grow and where there's a capacity for new things to happen. That relates to another point that I wanted to speak to. David mentions towards the end of the episode that he feels a little bit, it feels quite edgy for him, the fact he doesn't have editorial control. I think a friend of his has spoken to this. Here's a little clip from that part of the episode.
I did like an online meet-up with some good friends, and I told them that I was doing this therapy thing and that it was being filmed, and they were all very supportive. But there was one girl who contacted me, privately afterwards, away from everyone else, to sort of say, she sort of expressed some concern, some worry. She was like, I think it's quite dangerous for you to be that open and vulnerable, in that kind of way, it's and she also asked, did I have any sort of control over the edit? Did I have editorial control? And I wouldn't want editorial control, because the reason I'm doing that is doing this whole thing is because I'm interested to see what it reveals about me. I'm as interested as you lot to find out what's going on in my head and what makes me tick, and to see what this journey brings me.
So just to speak to that a little bit more, I think one of the reasons why a series like this has not been done before is this is incredibly sensitive and delicate territory that we take people into. We are in no way blind to that. We are in no way take that for granted. An enormous amount of care, and I talked about this in a previous episode, goes into carefully selecting the participants to make sure that they're the right people at the right time, that they don't require a level of support beyond which we think we're able to give them. So there's a lot of care that goes into this process, but equally, giving participants editorial control, I think, would make the production of the series very difficult, because it would mean every time we make an episode, we've got to send it out and wait for them to come back and give comments. We're often turning episodes around quite quickly. So although we film a few months ahead, often the episodes get finalized in the days before they're being released. In fact, on my list of things to film this afternoon is the outro for tomorrow's episode, to give you an example. And the danger would be that as participants watch themselves in the episodes, that their inner critic has all kinds of opinions and concerns and thoughts, and then their inner critic ends up editing the series, which is not going to work. I even have to be careful with this with myself. So when I review the episodes, I'm very careful in any edits that I give to the team that I'm not letting my inner critic say, oh, can you change? Don't like that camera angle on me, although it does happen from time to time. Don't like this bit. There was an episode that went out last week. I think it was actually David's episode. And I don't know what happened, but I watched it back, and someone commented on YouTube about this, that I said sort of like numerous times. And I think what was happening was partly, I don't actually remember specifically, but it may well have been one of those nights. I have 3 young kids. There are times I don't get a lot of sleep. And it might have been one of those nights where I was sleep deprived and sort of I was running on adrenaline to keep my system, keep myself awake and going. It might also have been, and it's probably also part of it, sometimes my brain is working hard in the background and I don't feel I'm quite tuned in to where I need to be tuned into. And sometimes it's a way that I'm buying time, but it's not something that I normally do. Anyway, I said to the team, oh my God, I'm mortified at what's happened. But the episode still goes out, right? It's not a case of, oh, I don't want people to see that. Every single episode of In Therapy that we can release, there's one participant we're filming with, and we've got a different plan. The plan is to release it in one go at some point. We've had a few people that have dropped out after a few episodes, after a few sessions, and that's why we wait for a while before releasing. But otherwise, every single session I've done with these participants has been released. And I think that's important. Otherwise, it's in danger of trying to kind of present myself in the best possible light, as opposed to actually showing the ups and the downs and the reality of the therapeutic journey that people go on. So going back to my point, by giving the participants the capacity to edit the episodes, I think it wouldn't work from a production point of view, but I also think somehow it causes more stress for them as well, because do I want this? Don't I want that? Instead, what happens is sometimes in the sessions, they'll say something and say, I don't want that to go in the series. And we always respect that. We're not trying to catch them out. We're not trying to do a sort of more of the dark end of TV, let's say, of how can we kind of force drama in a way that just doesn't feel authentic and ethical. So we always check in with them, particularly the early episodes, how it was for them. And so far, the feedback has been universally really, really positive. And there have been a few times where people have said, as I say, please don't include that. We've always honored that. And I think that's also built trust in the process as well. To give a shout out to Oliver and Rachel, who produced the series, a great deal of the sort of care that goes in is really driven by them as well. I'm really proud of the work that they do. So well done, guys. So I'm going to come to some questions now. The first question is from Jill. And Jill says, question for Alex, does our inner critic take us back to a time when we suffered from trauma? So Jill, yes, it can. one of the things that can happen, particularly certain inner critic attacks and certain sort of ways that it's learned to relate to us, that when those attacks come in, we find ourselves feeling small. I mean, that's one of the ways that I assess how effective we've been in defending against our inner critic is, do we feel more grown up and stronger and more in our power, or do we feel smaller? Do we feel that we've sort of had our power sucked out of us? So when our inner critic attacks us, part of what can happen is it's like taking us back to those young, vulnerable, childlike places. Also, one of the things that the inner critic does is it keeps trauma in place. It keeps us trapped, because when we're in that place of feeling delicate and small and vulnerable and like we don't have what it takes, we don't feel we have the capacity to heal. We don't have the capacity to come into our body and to feel and to connect to ourselves emotionally. The thing that I say to people about this is you have to remember with your inner critic, it is your power that it's using against you. A big part of learning to defend against your inner critic is taking that power back. That's why some of these stronger defenses, like telling it to F off, and as you see me doing with David in the episode, is important, because we're feeling our power. We're owning our power in the process of doing that. That can be very, very effective as part of our trauma healing. It may not be the only piece that we need, but taking back the power from our inner critic, defending against it and advocating for ourselves, saying yes to us and to our truth, that can be a very powerful and very effective and very healing process. We also had a question emailed in, which is, how do you stop projecting your inner critic onto other people? So one of the other things that can happen with the inner critic is it's not just the things that we say to ourselves. It's also not just the things that we say to or imagine saying to other people. We also can find ourselves projecting our inner critic onto others. And what that looks like is we're around others and we imagine all the ways that we think that they're judging us, criticizing us, beating us up. But it's not their thoughts. It's our inner critic we might think it's their thoughts, but it's our inner critic projected onto them. The world suddenly feels like a really vicious and really cruel place because our judgments are being projected onto everyone else. So how do you stop yourself from doing this? First thing, again, is awareness. If you can see it, you don't have to be it. If you can see that this is what's happening, that all of your judgments are being projected onto everyone else, just the seeing of that alone may take the energy out of that, may discharge what's happening. It's also helpful sometimes to inquire into what are we attempting to get through doing that. What I mean by that is sometimes the world, in a very sort of odd way, feels more familiar because it's what we've known. And if everyone's judging us and criticizing us and attacking us is in our mind, we sort of know where we stand. And that means that, they're seeing us the way that we are used to seeing ourselves. In a very strange way, when we're small and we're desperate for attention, sometimes feeling criticized and feeling judged is a form of love, because it's like people love us enough to be cruel and be unkind to us. They're seeing us enough to do that. Sometimes the architect of our trauma is also the custodian of our love and support, and that can be a very confusing dynamic for us to experience. So in terms of stopping, there's a lot more to this than I can sort of unpack in a sort of few minutes, but one of the things is awareness. Really try and, you might want to do an exercise that I set a lot of the participants, which is do a thought diary at the end of each day and write down what are all the times in the day and all the judgments that you projected onto other people towards yourself. The more awareness you can get, that alone will take away some of the sting, some of the power from that pattern. You might also want to inquire into, how does it make you feel? Does it give you anything positive that, again, just the seeing of that can help take away some of the power from that? So I hope that's been helpful in terms of answering questions. Remember, you can always send in questions via emailing hello@alexhoward.com. You can also post questions below the videos on YouTube. We go in there and we look for the questions, and that's how you can put questions into the podcast. Reminder of a few things. Today, we've just opened the promo series for the next intake of the Reset program. All of the participants in therapy, this is behind the scenes what they're doing, which is building momentum and giving them the teaching and the understanding that we're then working with. The Reset program is designed primarily towards learning how to calm and reset your nervous system. It's very effective for people with energy issues, with trauma, with self-esteem issues. If you've resonated and connected with the content in therapy, I really encourage you to sign up for the free 3-part video series. They're just under an hour long, each of the videos. It's some of the best of my ideas and insight. Really, the difference is in these episodes, you're seeing little snapshots in the sort of podcast of my ideas, and in therapy, you're following people's journeys. If you really want to understand what I'm doing and how and why I'm doing it, watch this free 3-part series. And then at the end, you'll have a video that comes out today on Thursday, second on Monday, and the third on the following Thursday. And at that point, registration will open for the next intake of the program. It's open for about 3 or 4 days. So if you'd like to go deeper, you'd like to work with me in that supported way, I'd love to have you as part of the next Reset program. Also, a reminder, we've been posting some, I think, really good content on Instagram. We've been posting some reminders from the episodes. We've been doing some what they call carousels, like series of photos that really bring some of these ideas to life and I think can be a really helpful support. So if you're not already following me on Instagram, please go and follow me on Instagram. I always would appreciate it. Next week, we will be exploring Katie's latest episode, and that will have come out by now, so you'll be able to go and watch that. We're really getting deeper into her relationship with herself, and I introduced this idea of get into jail free cards. You know, in the game Monopoly, you have these get out of jail free cards. There are certain ways of thinking and relating to ourselves that almost guarantee we get into a psycho and emotional prison. And that's what I'm getting into with Katie. Hope you enjoyed this week's episode. As always, be kind to yourself. Go gently.